How did you come to be in the RAF in the first place, please?
Well, I'd always wanted to be in the RAF, and I went along to see a recruiting office in early September and said I'd like to join the RAF aircrew, and was told there was no guarantee that if I were to join then I could ever become aircrew, as they had as many pilots as they wanted.
September, which year was it?
39. They suggested, as I was due for call-up, I was nearly 20, fairly soon, that it'd be best to wait and then ask, and I would have a much better chance. So in March I took my medical, March 40, and apparently passed A1, but in due course, despite the preference for the RAF, I found myself in the Army. First of all, I went to the Royal Fusiliers Depot in West London, completed training there, but this coincided with the evacuation from Dunkirk, and all the remnants of the Army people had gathered outside Oxford, or most of them I believe, and we were drafted in, so I then went into the first 6 Queen's Royal Regiment. I stayed with them. I volunteered when this request was circulated in 1940 that anyone who wished to volunteer for RAF flying duties could do so. And so I applied, and it took 2 or 3 months for me to get permission. I had my medical, and in about, I think it was the end of June 1941, yes, June 41, I transferred to the RAF.
Did you find it much different from the Army?
Oh, very much so, because in the Army there was a sort of camaraderie which was never quite the same in the RAF. In the Army, we'd certainly roughed everything. We were short of things. An example was that we were issued with palliasses to sleep on, the intention being to fill them with straw. It took 8 months before we got the straw, so we slept inside the palliasses, using them as glorified sleeping bags. Conditions in the RAF were very much better. It was a much higher plane. It really was quite a good transition, but we never quite recaptured, except within the crew itself, the same sort of feeling that we had, that I had in the Army, and I'm talking for other people who did the same, who transferred across at much the same time.
So the lack of facilities in the Army brought people closer together?
Yes, we had to, if you sleep in a hut, about 30 or 40 of you crammed in, or in a house, in some cases a condemned accommodation, sleeping on top of each other virtually. It really brought people close together.
Can you tell me something about the training that you had for aircrew, how adequate it was for what was to come later?
I thought it was very adequate. I felt somehow, under the circumstances, they were rather prolonged. I appreciated in peacetime the RAF wanted to have people go right back to the nut and bolt stage in order to understand what was developing later. But my own feeling was that a lot of these things could be short-circuited, and I was even more convinced at a later stage. However, I did appreciate the degree of training. The quality of training was extremely good. Training took place over possibly, it was nearly 2 years, in fact, after I'd started training that I commenced on my first operational station. The sequence was an initial training wing, which was held at St Andrews University in Scotland. After a spell there of about 6 weeks, we passed down to Eastbourne for what was called an Elementary Air Observers training school. Having completed that course, we went to South Africa, where at number 45 Air School, Oudtshoorn, Oudtshoorn, we did a complete navigation course with bombing theory. The second phase of that course was spent on the Indian Ocean, on the coast, a place called Kawi, where we put into effect the practical side of the bombing, using ranges on the very wide sandy beaches.
Cowie? How is that spelled?
Kowie. It had an alternative name, which was Port Alfred. After that, I was commissioned at Cape Town, and within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, we returned to England.
Before you leave South Africa, could I ask you how you were received there, and what the attitude of people there was towards the war?
Well, I personally and most of my colleagues were received extremely well. We saw little or no anti-feeling, but prior to our getting to Oudtshoorn, there had been a rather nasty incident in that an organisation called the Ossifer Brandwerk, the OBs, had really attacked the camp. The aerodrome was based on an old racecourse, the racecourse at Oudtshoorn, and there'd been a full-scale attack on the post, people coming in for miles, I believe, to do so, and a full-scale fight developed without arms, without shooting, but nevertheless with clubs and everything else that could be reached. And I was told the story of the CO standing in the middle of all his people, urging everyone on and swinging a billiard cue as part of this. After that one spell of quite a bit of violence, nothing else developed, and the whole time we were there, about 5 or 6 months, there was not even a sign or murmur anywhere. And most of the people we met were extremely friendly, and we were invited into houses, which more or less confirmed with that.
These OBs were pro-Germans, were they?
Yes, they were very much the right-wing Nazi-type organisation. The name meant Knights of a Burning Flame. One of these titles has been thought up.
You presumably learnt about this by
word of mouth from the people actually on the station who'd been there at the time. The CO, incidentally, I mentioned, was an ex-Battle of Britain, I believe, DFC and Bar, but I can't recollect his name, unfortunately.
Did you notice any difference between the people of Dutch origin and the people of British origin in their attitude towards the war?
I think possibly we didn't meet so many people of Dutch origin. Most of them were of English origin. We did meet one or two, and again there was no change of attitude. No, we were taken in, even onto a farm outside, which is in the area of the well-known Kango Caves, this terrific underground complex that's been there for millions of years. This culminates in a complete day at the farm, being fed, and the farmer himself was an invalid, or had been invalided out of the South African forces. He had two sons growing up, and we really couldn't have been made more welcome, but he himself had been subjected to problems from the local farmers of Boer descent. There'd been quite a bit of sabotage on his farm a few years before.
Now, I'd interrupted you with you telling me about the sequence of training, if you can take it from there.
Yes, I came back to Bournemouth, where we were allocated then to the next stage, which was the operational training unit. I was posted to Wing in Buckinghamshire, the Wing being the name of the village and having no RAF significance. There we flew rather ancient Wellingtons, ancient in wartime terms, 1Cs, which were in a very bad state, and what with a combination of an extremely wet winter and the poor quality of the planes, our training there was considerably extended, and it wasn't until March that we were completely clear of that stage of training. Then we went north to a place outside York called Rufford, where we did a heavy conversion training course. This took the pilot particularly from twin-engine aircraft to four-engine Halifaxes. Having completed our course then, we were posted onto an operational squadron, number 77, at Elvington, which was the other side of York.
If I could interrupt you there, could I ask you whether you and your comrades in the RAF thought it extraordinary that it should take nearly 2 years to train you to go into the war, that whether you thought that there should have been more urgency in getting you into the front line?
I don't remember this coming up as a particular subject, but I think we all generally felt that it was rather prolonged, possibly due to the development of the air training scheme. We did feel that occasionally some of the training had been put in to slow down our progress because they weren't ready for us at a later stage. But that's purely a feeling.
That they couldn't absorb all the trainees who were coming off the production line?
At a certain stage, yes. This obviously fluctuated from time to time.
On operations, can you start off by telling me something about the character of 77 Squadron?
Yes, it had been a squadron which had had Whitleys before, switching to Halifaxes. The type of Halifax then being flown had Rolls-Royce inline engines. Their overall performance was perhaps not quite as good as the then current Lancasters. The squadron itself was one of a clutch of three, the clutch being the term used then, with a senior officer in charge of the clutch, who in this case happened to be Gus Walker, a well-known character in the RAF, a former rugby player who had had his arm blown off a year or so earlier during an incident of a returning Lancaster blowing up when he was there. Anyway, he was clutch commander. The other two squadrons were 102 and 10, or Shiny 10.
Why Shiny?
This is something I never found out for myself, but it was so called. 10 itself probably had a number of, it was probably more well known than the others in that it had had previously Cheshire as squadron commander and DCT Bennett. I came obviously after both of these had left the squadron.
Did they leave any reputation behind, which you heard about?
Not particularly at that stage. Odd things came through much later after I'd left 77 Squadron, but jumping ahead, I actually joined 10 Squadron for my second tour. We were based to the east of York, and for that reason most of our trips outward bound went over places like Filey Bay, Scarborough. These were the last points of landfall before we set off across the North Sea.
What kind of an aerodrome was Elvington?
It was, as you'd expect, flat, subject to a little bit of mist at times, particularly at dawn, but otherwise quite a good aerodrome, although it did have a disconcerting row of trees outside the end of the runway itself. But otherwise the station facilities weren't bad at all. We even had our own drowned quarry as a swimming pool for the odd occasion we were off operations. It was a business-like squadron. It was run by the first CO, first gunner, I think it was, gunner CO, Lofty Lowe. It was unusual for someone to be promoted to a squadron, and I believe he was the first of his type. An extremely nice man who survived the war and whom I met after the war.
You were saying earlier on about camaraderie in the RAF and camaraderie in the squadron. Do you think that the esprit de corps, or the loyalty of the men towards a particular squadron like 77 Squadron would have been equivalent to a naval man to his ship or an army man to his regiment?
I think in peacetime this would almost certainly have been the case, but in wartime we were coming through and people were disappearing overnight. You'd see a crew turn up in the morning and they were gone by that evening when the pressure was on. And what did happen was, I feel, as a form of self-defense, you did not associate too closely with anybody. I think this was you felt that perhaps it would harm you if you got to know too many people and it would affect your morale and so on there. But within your own crew, certainly there was this kind of fellow feeling. But with other crews, only a few did you get on. One or two that you did do, you got on extremely well with. But by and large, when we were operating and probably had as many as 35 to 40 crews on the station, you probably only had 2 or 3 of those that you got to know reasonably well.
Can you tell me about the particular bomber crew that you were put in with to start off with?
Yes, the pilot had been trained in Canada, Navigator 2, I believe. Because of the development of training, going back to the wider use of 4-engined aircraft, the particular duty of Navigator bomb aimer, or observer as he was known in the earlier days, had been split into 2. There was a change in the constitution of a crew, whereas there'd been 2 pilots and 1 observer. About 1942 they split them into the pilot and a navigator and a bomb aimer. In the Halifax, the bomb aimer was trained to do part of the pilot's duties to the extent of flying straight and level to enable the remainder of the crew to bail out in the unhappy event of the pilot being killed. But that was as far as it went. In the Lancaster, I believe the engineer had the same job. But it did mean that the bomb aimer and the navigator worked as a team. And with the advent of the H2S and G and things like this, that became very much a working relationship between the 2.
You were a bomb aimer?
Yes, I was an observer. I was trained as an observer, full observer, but one of the problems, as I was about to mention, was that in Canada they trained a lot of people on navigation only and not got as far as the bomb aiming and gunnery side at all. We came back from South Africa just as a large draft came from Canada, and the result was that all the observers from South Africa were made bomb aimers because they'd had the full training, whereas the Canadian navigators had just had the one side. Most of the bomb aimers felt it was rather in for dig after all the navigation training we'd had. But eventually, because of this working relationship as a team, this was rather lost.
What was it like flying the Lancaster in those days? What was it like to be inside? Halifax, sorry.
Yes, I did fly in a Lancaster, but only on training, in between operations. The Halifax was a very comfortable aircraft, better than the Lancaster, much more creature comforts in many ways, bigger, and it didn't have that infamous Lancaster main spar which ran right through the centre of the fuselage. The Halifax had a nice wide open rest position, which was used for takeoff and in case of emergencies as well.
What was this main spar on the Lancaster?
The wing itself ran right through the fuselage, and the main spar was about, I should think, 2 foot above the level of the actual fuselage, so that when you went through, particularly when you were encumbered with flying helmet, Mae West, parachute harness, intercom cords, you had to climb over this thing to get through to the compartment, the engineers and pilots' compartments there. And it was quite a thing. It wasn't relished by anybody.
Something of an obstacle race.
It could be, yes. Because going through any aircraft, particularly flying at night, could be an obstacle race with all sorts of things reaching out to grab and pull things off, like the watch spindle and so on. So the Lancaster was no worse than, say, the Stirling or the Halifax in that respect.
Because of the cramped conditions?
Yes, so much instrumentation, and there was no attempt made to hide this. It was there, it was functional, not decorative. You had to watch yourself going through.
Did one develop an affection for the Halifax?
Oh yes, very much so. We found people that had flown on Halifaxes really did like the Halifax, and while it always was in the shadow of the Lancaster, anyone who'd flown on the two, really for any length of time, preferred the comfort of the Halifax, while initially they preferred the power and the heavy weight carrying capacity of the Lancaster. However, at the end of 1943, the engines on the Halifax were changed to Hercules 16s, and the extra amount of power there was really tremendous, and put the Halifax on a level with the Lanc, and if not a little bit in advance of it. This had been a decision at one stage when the Hercules 16 engine had been developed. They were going to put it onto the Lanc, but they had the problem that on operations they were probably putting up 600 Lancasters to about 400 Halifaxes. If they'd put the better engines onto the Lancaster, they would increase the difference in speed between the two types, which was not what they wanted on their mass raids. So rather than make the Lancaster even better, they put these engines onto the Halifax to bring them up to the standard. The height was increased, and the speed certainly was increased. A small side point was that in the end of 1943, a Halifax 3, the new Mark, could climb faster than the Spit 1 in 1939. And that was with a full bomb and petrol load on board.
Can you remember your first operation?
Well, against a background of many operations, I can really remember very little. Yes, because it was the first, and also because it was going to be a simple introduction, and it was a mine-laying trip to the Dutch coast. The problem with mine-laying was that at that stage of development of the techniques, was that you had to fly to a coast, to a particular point on the enemy coast, and then turn round and fly out a measured number of miles in a certain direction before dropping on mines. That was the only technique. There was no other accurate way of doing it. Unfortunately, of course, the Germans knew this, and either on the headlands or in other places they had flak ships which could be moved around and extremely heavy, so that we used to lose a number of low-flying mine-laying planes. On many an occasion, completely unexpectedly, the whole lot would open up on you, and the aircraft would go down. We went with this background knowledge. We went to the Dutch coast, we did as we were told, and we had 2 extremely large special mines on board. That was all we could take, they were so large. The drill was that as you came off, the mines were dropped, that would be my job. The rear gunner was to look out for the 2 parachutes as they came out on the mines to identify they'd gone. Well, we were all novices, the rear gunner too, and he reported seeing 2 white things. And we all settled down and went back across the North Sea, but part of our drill, we've been taught, was to open the bomb bays and have a look to check there was nothing wrong there, halfway across the North Sea. Now, with mines, we weren't allowed to drop them. but we had to check anyway. So I opened the ports in the fuselage. One side was clear, but when I looked on the other side, there was still one of the mines hanging up. We later worked out that the rear gunner must have seen a splash and a parachute and mistaken the two going down. Anyway, we came back to base, but as we were getting near the Yorkshire coast, there was a terrible smell in the aircraft, and we found that I went back to check and found fluid all over the fuselage at the rest position. One of our so-called accumulators had burst, and which meant that we had no flaps, in other words, no brakes. With a mine on board and no brakes, we were in a bit of an awkward situation. We came back to our own drome, Elvington, and we were made to circle for about an hour and a half, fortunately had enough petrol, before they decided what to do. And then they made us fly to a lame duck drome, a special drone for aircraft to crash on at Carnaby, fairly newly opened, I believe. As we had no brakes, we knew we'd have to come in at a fair speed and hope to sort of have a long run before we came to a stop. We had no way of knowing how the mine was attached to the aircraft, and I'm afraid our heart was in our mouth, but fortunately we came down, had a very soft landing, and ran the full tilt of the aerodrome before we came to a stop. When this was examined and there was a subsequent court of inquiry, it was found not only our aircraft, but I believe at least a dozen Halifaxes had the same problem, had brought a mine back. And it was one of these constant modifications that were being carried out in the RAF throughout, almost every day in some cases. A single number 8 screw had gone through somewhere and had actually found the bomb hook, so that while the unit had fired and the bomb was hanging on a hook, free to rotate, a single number 8 screw was holding the whole thing in position. And I don't know what the weight of the mine was. It was probably 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. But it's amazing how much can depend, as I say, on a single screw like that. We did remember our first trip. We never saw any real flak from the other side, but that was an interesting introduction to the question of ops.
Have you got the date of that trip?
28th of April. We took off at 1:10 in the morning, and we flew 5 hours 20 minutes on that trip.
You're reading that off from your logbook, we should say, so it's accurate.
Yes.
Now, were you chosen to do that mine laying operation because it was your first operation? Was it a means of breaking you in?
I think this would have been a possibility. On the other hand, the very next trip we did, which was 2 days later, was rather like going into the deep end. We went to the Ruhr and we went to Essen, of all places, which was reckoned to be the most heavily defended target around, and a fair proportion of the 30,000 guns that Goering claimed he had round the Ruhr were situated round Essen. We did a type of bombing run called a Wanganui. For camouflage purposes, we used New Zealand Maori terms for a number of these different techniques. Wanganui meant bombing through cloud. So they couldn't use the usual ground markers, and we used sky markers. A little more crude than the ground marking, but we had to use these flares to bomb on. I actually bombed on the flares as instructed, but in our ignorance had not realized that during the run-up we had stayed straight and level for more than the proper time. The result was that we were picked up by what we reckon was a 12-gun battery, and we suddenly found shells all round us. We had been told that by the old hands that if you could see them, that wasn't too bad. If you could feel the effects, that was near enough. But if you could smell them, that was too close. One piece of shell came through the nose, just above my head, went through the curtain behind between myself and the navigator, missed the wireless operator by inches, and went into the port inner engine and blew that. And that blew up, and we suddenly found ourselves with an engine burning with about 20, 30 foot of flames. This was bad enough, but just at that moment our Canadian rear gunner called up on the intercom to the pilot and said, "Daff, there's a 110 on our tail." The pilot's reply at that moment, with a burning engine and himself attempting to dive the aircraft, was very succinct. He said, "I've got my own troubles, shoot the so-and-so down." And that was that. Fortunately for us, the plane evidently thought we were already a gunner and sheared off, so we didn't even open fire. But we had to go through as a novice crew all the correct procedure. The one thing you couldn't afford to have was a dead prop idling, even if you managed to put the flames out, because this would have doubled the problems on that same side. No engine, and yet have a drag. So there was a correct procedure in which to feather the prop, press the gravinus switches to get the fire extinguishers going, and to dive, as many people did, to try and help put out the flames. The combination of all these did succeed, and the flames went out, and we were probably down to about 17,000 feet. We had dropped our bombs, so we then set off for the coast with one engine completely US. But although it took us rather longer because we got a headwind coming back, the rest of the trip was virtually uneventful except for being fired at by flak fairly closely over the coast itself. So the visit to Essen had a few lessons for us, which we took to heart. Staying straight and level as long as we did is something we never repeated on running up to a target.
Did you then, on this tour of duty with 77 Squadron, did you concentrate on raids on the Ruhr?
Quite a few. Yes, I did about 9 or 10 trips to the Ruhr, because it really was a place that was dreaded to some extent. It's had the euphemistic name among air crews of Happy Valley, in the same way as Berlin had the name of Big City. It was not a kind of target you relished when you saw it go up on the board in the operations room.
But presumably Berlin was just as feared, was it?
We only did one trip on Berlin, and that was quite an eventful one. Later on, yes, but most of the trips on Berlin were done at night, at a period when the opposition was probably in balance. At different times during the war, the night fighters seemed to have the advantage. Other times, they seemed to sort of be the other way around. We lost a lot of aircraft, probably due to flying conditions as much as the actual fighters, although the fighters were the thing that was concerned there. Yes, people got tired of going to Berlin, certainly from what I heard, but I'd finished my first tour before the multiple Berlin raids came on.
What was your trip to Berlin like?
Pretty hectic. We took off from Yorkshire. We discovered soon after takeoff we got a dicky engine on one side. I think it was a port-inner, the Merlin, the glycol was obviously leaking somewhere, so that we had the usual story of temperatures going up and pressure falling. But it was gradual to begin with, and it wasn't until we got to the Dutch coast that we had a little crew conference to decide whether we should carry on or not with a one bad engine. The decision was reached. The skipper always made the final decision, but he always consulted the other people, that we would, as we were in the first wave, we'd carry on flying as best we could at reduced speed, and that he would throttle the engine back so it was just ticking over, with the idea that if we had an emergency, he would open it up and we'd get away, possibly. So we flew right across the target to Berlin, which was quite a distance at that time, falling back throughout the stream the whole time. When we got to Berlin, by the way, the attack that night to fool the Germans was based on the idea of a turning point which was about, from memory, 20 or 30 miles southeast of Berlin. And then we did a sharp left-hand turn and ran back over Berlin, having given the idea we were going past it. Just as we got to the turning point, the engine blew up. And once again, for the second time, we had ourselves really in trouble with flames everywhere, going everywhere. We managed to put the fire out by dropping considerably, and we were down to 13,000 feet. And we again had a very brief conversation to decide what we should do. We could have taken a chance legitimately by going round the target in our present state and hoping to avoid main trouble and get back that way, or to go through the middle. Well, one of the problems was that at briefing that day, we'd been told that the Germans had perfected a new form of light flak, something that was really feared, which could go up to 15,000 feet, and to watch out for it that night. We were down to 13,000 feet below within that range, if that were true. And so there was quite a bit of foreboding as we went right through the middle. I managed to identify what I thought was the target that night from the flares, from the target indicators, and dropped my bombs, and we carried on. The peculiar thing was that as we sailed right through the centre of Berlin, with a whole lot lit up underneath us, planes above were being shot down right and left, and we had no fighter or flak attacks the whole time. We went right through the middle, and we came out the other side somewhere around 11 or 12,000 feet, absolutely unscathed. We flew home, but because of the engine trouble, we were rather slow, and we were almost given up at base. We were over an hour late landing at base, and it was thought we'd gone west, because I think we'd lost about 30 or 40 four-engined aircraft within 20 minutes over Berlin that night. But that was the only trip we ever did to Berlin, and we didn't want to repeat it under quite those same circumstances.
Do you have the date of that raid?
Yes. This, by the way, was the 23rd of August 1943. As a result of the night's operation and the work that had to be done by both the pilot and the engineer, both were awarded immediate DFMs. I believe that the rest of the crew received some sort of commendation as well.
You said that if the Ruhr went up as the target for that night, that people were a bit down in the mouth about it.
I think more apprehensive rather than down the mouth, because there was no visible sign of anything like panic or anything like that at all. People accepted things apparently matter-of-factly, but had even made rather grim jokes about the particular targets, but it wasn't sort of, shall I say, immediately visible, any reaction that way, except to say, oh, blow our so-and-so luck, or something like that, or I've got a date tomorrow, blow my so-and-so luck for being on this one tonight, and so on. I think you were saying about Berlin, yes, I believe Berlin and the Ruhr were probably two of the worst targets that people would rather not go to, let's put it that way.
But presumably people were suppressing their apprehensions. Did it come out in any physical or mental ways?
Yes, it came out in the form of tics, as it well known, usually under the eye. You'd get a little pulse beating there. Sometimes it happened and it wasn't visible, but you could feel it. And I must admit, towards the end of that tour, I had a non-visible tic, which under my right eye I could feel, and this we were told was due to the accumulation of tensions one way or the other. As an example of that, we had a signals leader who'd done 30 trips and had volunteered for a 31st, which officially weren't allowed to do at that time. He was the personification of someone who didn't care, who never worried at all. After he was taken off operations, which was shortly after that, they examined him because he'd had trouble with his neck and found all the nerves in his neck were absolutely tied up. His tension apparently had gone to one part of his body, and that was his way of absorbing the tension that had accumulated elsewhere. It was just in the neck.
Did you have people who actually cracked up under the strain?
I never saw anyone. You know the term LMF, lack of moral fibre. That was feared by a lot of people more than going on ops, perhaps. But
of being branded with it?
Being branded with LMF, which was a rather disgusting thing, I felt, particularly if people had done a number of operations, their nerves had simply gone, they couldn't take it. As you probably know, they were stripped of all rank. All their documents were endorsed LMF, and they were reduced to the ranks and posted to some of the worst situations, so I understand.
What do you mean by the worst situation?
Well, sort of outlying stations, I believe, anything where the jobs were not considered exactly decent one way or the other. But it was a sort of double disgrace. On the other hand, I don't think LMF, fear of LMF, was a major point in people's decision to go on. In most cases, it was felt, as far as I could observe, that it was a job to be done, and you did it, or you did your best to do it.
So, which were the preferred targets if the Ruhr and Berlin were not?
Well, I'm talking about over 3 years, over the period of 3 or 4 years, but obviously French targets, if there were any. We did Milan on one trip, which was considered a very easy trip. The highlight of that was to fly on a brilliant moonlight night within 20 miles of Mont Blanc and see the contrast between the snow tops and the dark caverns down below. The opposition at Milan was nominal, and we felt that the searchlights were probably being operated by the crews, who ran out, spun the thing round and round in circles, then ran back to the shelter because no attempt was made to pick up aircraft. So that was a comparatively uneventful raid, although we did lose a few aircraft, probably about 4 or 5, principally, we believe, because of engine trouble and trying to negotiate over the mountains. Most of them probably crashed on that. We came back on that particular trip to the south of England because of the length of the flight, coming down from Yorkshire there. A lot of aircraft were running out of fuel. And as we approached Great Britain, we received instructions to come down on drones in the south, in some cases fighter drones as well, which, frankly, for 4-engined aircraft wasn't exactly the right thing. We were given a drone in the south to land at. We weren't too badly off, but as we were coming over the coast, we could hear other aircraft calling out that they were going up to a reasonable height, bailing out. And hoping the aircraft would go into the sea. This happened quite a few times, and we could see crashes and explosions every so often, so we knew some people were really experiencing shortage of fuel. We had a slight adventure before we got down, in that the outer circles of the fighter drones were very close to each other. We contacted the drone concerned. We got our permission to land in a certain sequence. But as we came into land, another aircraft landed just underneath us. And it took all that we could do, my skipper and myself, pushing the throttles forward to lift us off the top of that aircraft and get round again. My skipper called up flying control, and what he didn't tell them about their antecedents wasn't worth knowing. They gave us permission very humbly to come round again. So we came round again and landed uneventfully. The skipper said, you know, I'm going to add to what I said when I go to the flying control tower to report in. He joined us a little later and he was a little sort of quiet, so we said, what happened? He said, it was only as I was walking into flying control I saw the name of the aerodrome there. We've landed at the wrong drome. We've been taking instructions of one drome and ending up the other. So it was our fault completely, or of course because of the closeness of the dromes. So we actually landed at Odium.
You mentioned those searchlight operators at Milan, you guessed not doing their job properly.
Yeah.
If I can ask you the same thing about RAF aircrew, was it possible for an aircrew to avoid doing their job properly to save their own skins? Were there any kind of wrinkles that they could indulge in?
No, I never heard of anything like... Well, I'll tell you about a small technique that we evolved, but I wasn't quite sure whether you were suggesting that they might be dodging the column by not even attacking the target. That's a separate matter, and I believe there were cases, very, very few, I'm told, where people actually flew either up and down the North Sea for the requisite time, but I think there was only one case where this was ever proved. But this did happen. It's possible that going to a target in the earlier years, a pilot might have gone rather on the outskirts rather than go through the middle. But with the introduction of cameras on every aircraft, bombing aircraft, I think in 42 or 43, it meant you had a pictorial record because the camera, the F-24, was operated from the bomb push, the bomb release, and which released a flash and at the appropriate time opened the shutter, so that you got a picture which was not identical with where your bombs would drop, but was a very good indication of where you'd actually gone, on what heading and everything else you were on. It's possible it still continued. On some occasions, of course, the TIs, target indicators, were fairly widely distributed, so possibly people would pick off the outer edge in the hope that they wouldn't go through the middle of the worst of flak. As far as the technique I was mentioning a little earlier was concerned, is that we, at about the time we were in 43, I think we were really getting onto the Ruhr, the Germans had brought in these radar-controlled searchlights. And the idea seemed to be that one searchlight was a master searchlight for possibly a dozen non-radar. And it was very disconcerting. We found that these radar searchlights could almost come straight out on you, straight out of the blue without looking for you. And the idea was that they would do that and all the other searchlights would come onto you in the form of a tent and would hold you. Once they'd got you, it was very difficult to get out of that number of searchlights. We discovered that, or I'd noticed that on the ground, these blue searchlights, the master ones, appeared to move round on the ground first before getting their elevation. And every time I saw this happen, I got the pilot to turn in the opposite direction, and we developed a technique on going up to the target of turning in. The closing speed, obviously, of the aircraft and the searchlight was very much greater, and we only once ever got coned, and that was over Frankfurt. But
what was it like being in a cone?
Very, very disconcerting indeed. Everything was brilliant light. You knew that they were belting flak at you in the searchlights, and it was a heck of a job to try and dive and turn and twist. Particularly, in this case, we still had our bomb load on. We knew the strain on the aircraft itself, but we managed to dodge on that occasion, but we were even more wary later on, particularly at Frankfurt.
Now, can you touch on this question of the accuracy of bombing, which obviously concerned you, especially as a bomb aimer, because there's been a lot of controversy about it in the books written about the bombing offensive. What are your own opinions about it as someone who actually flew operations?
Well, when we were given the target maps, there was a specific target to aim for. There was no doubt about that. However, we did know that the pattern of bombing was such that it would spread. Spreading back was mostly as a result of a tailback. That was the expression used. That because as you ran up to a target, so people would bomb a little bit short, looking at the target indicators, and even some of the pathfinders seemed to be falling short as well. And as the bombing rate progressed, so gradually the bombs fell shorter and shorter in a sort of a mat-like arrangement. The photographs, of course, told their story, and after each raid, Bomber Command issued to all intelligence rooms on the stations maps showing the actual plots of each aircraft's bombing with its letter and squadron number. The WAFs who did the plotting were superhuman in the way they could plot photographs, because a photograph without a single vestige of ground on it could be plotted very accurately by them, purely from fires. The time and the incidents of new fires they could get, and a comparison with other people's photographs where there was perhaps a tiny identification point, they could map very accurately where a plane had dropped its bombs, despite the fact, as I say, there was no ground visible at all. The aiming points, APs as we used to call them, was for a lot of us, was the aim. Our intention was to get a photograph with the AP on. I was very lucky in the early days particularly of getting quite a few. In some of the bigger raids later on, you didn't have much of a chance because the whole place was absolutely a sea of flames or white light on clouds and things like that, so there was very little point. But earlier on, and I did get a special commendation for the so-called photographs. In this case, the photographs were there.
This is your citation dated
18th of January 1944.
For DFC.
Relates to the operations on 77 Squadron. Would you like me to read that part?
Yes, please.
With due modesty, Flying Officer Treadwell's task as bomb aimer in this crew has been carried out in a manner worthy of the highest praise. The photographic record, that of course is the photographic record of the target, is one of sustained brilliance, aiming point being secured on several occasions against important targets. The use of these photographs was a very good way of checking on whether people were consistently going off target or going for it. But as I say, there was a certain amount of rivalry among small groups as to who could get the most aiming points. That was particularly, as I say, in the early days when targets could be identified very readily.
What about the bombing aids that you used regularly, like H2S and so on?
Well, as part of the navigation team, I did use the H2S. G I only used unofficially when the navigator allowed me to do a bit of certain amount of navigation when things were a little bit quiet. H2S was a piece of equipment which I liked very much. There was quite a bit of guesswork, as you probably know. H2S gave you a bearing and a direction. The special radar maps which were prepared for us showed the outline of the various towns and of course the coastlines that we could expect to see as we went along.
We've got one in front of us, we should say, and the towns are shown as brown blobs.
Yes, roughly the shape. The problem was that, of course, on the coastline particularly, it didn't differentiate between high and low tide, which meant that at low tide, the shape of a headland could be completely changed, or bays and so on there, and it didn't help. As far as the shape of the towns are concerned, it didn't really help at all. All that really mattered was this relative size of the town, and what you had to do was to associate the bigger blobs with the smaller ones and try and fix up a pattern as you saw it on the radar screen. You could often get a fix going across the Ruhr with short of the Ruhr perhaps, because the Ruhr was rather confusing, but you could get a fix on other towns 10-15 miles away, and by means of triangulation you could establish pretty exactly where you were. There were occasions when it was very difficult to know which, say, of three towns you'd got. You two groups of three towns, either of which, but there you had to rely on the fact that by calculated navigation you should have been nearer one than the other to help solve that particular problem. We did find it a great help, and we didn't realise at the time that the waves that were going out were actually helping the Germans in many cases to detect our aircraft as well. But certainly H2S was a great aid, there's no doubt about that.
And oboe, did you ever use that?
No, oboe was only on mosquitoes of Pathfinder Force. The oboe system was to have two ground stations in this country, and they would meet over a particular point. The mosquito flew until he met the intersection, and the actual dropping of the bomb over the markers was arranged from this side. The pilot didn't do this, no one on board, it was dropped from here. Of course, the system was very accurate indeed. It measured in sort of hundreds of yards on the Ruhr. The mosquitoes were responsible originally for putting down the yellow flares, and then finally the yellow markers as the first stage for the backup by the reds and greens dropped by Pathfinder main force.
Are there any other trips that stick out in your mind about which you can give the details?
Yes, a couple in particular. One on Hamburg and one on Peenemünde. Dealing with the last one first, this has been a well-publicised raid. It had many unusual features for us. We were bombing low level. They'd introduced a new technique, a quarter spot fire for marking a particular position. But I think the raid has been written up pretty well. I think as we went across the Baltic, on the way to Peenemünde, the impression was a brilliant moonlight, all the islands standing out, and then a mist or fog coming up, and then finding ourselves just short of the target early, and we've been warned not to bomb before time, and as a result, a lot of aircraft did a dogleg to port. The trouble was we were all at a fairly low level, and we were missing each other's aircraft, sometimes by, it seemed, feet. Stirlings, Halifaxes and Lancasters going in. Peenemünde is on the coast, with the coast stretching out towards the north, and what was obviously at one time a continuation of a ridge was a small island. On that island they dropped this red spot fire, which was, I believe, a 2,000-pound canister stuffed with cotton wool and phosphorus. That was a very good indication, and as we flew over that, we were lined up straight for the Peenemünde itself. We were carrying no incendiaries, which was unusual, because the idea was not to spoil the aim of the people coming behind. We saw a lot of our own aircraft naturally going in, and we dropped ours. I dropped ours on what I saw to be the target, and as we came out, just as we came out, that was when this well-publicised sweep of the German fighters coming from Berlin took place. And so we saw a lot of aircraft going down round about us. Our route lay north across the Baltic and then turned short of the Swedish coast. We'd been given alternative crash drones in Sweden if we were really in trouble, so we had those there. But we had had little or no trouble. We had, however, been warned there might be just one or two light flak guns in the area, and we were not surprised when, as we came out of the target area and turned, we heard a terrific banging noise underneath the aircraft, followed by quite a smell of burning. We thought we were on fire. The rear gunner turned his turret on the beam to look along the fuselage and spotted something red which was getting bigger. So he immediately called up and said, "Skipper, we're on fire amidships." And I had to go back. He asked me to go back to check to see how bad it was. When I got there, first of all, I found that there was no fire, that the little red lights that we carried inside the fuselage with a shutter on the top of them, one had been jolted by this out of position. So as it was turning, so it was getting brighter and brighter red, which looked like a fire, which meant as we'd got no visible fire, why was the smell of burning? I went back to my position to find the camera had burnt out. Back at base, we only then discovered what the noise was. We'd been carrying a larger than usual high-capacity bomb, and it had not been possible to close the bomb doors, and a cable had been used for some reason or other around the bomb itself. This may have been standard practice for the bigger ones. And the cable had been trapped in between the bomb doors as they closed, and was wanging either side of the aircraft as we turned. And this approximated to what we thought was light flak firing at us. So, to my mind, although we saw lots of aircraft shot down, and obviously it was a very serious raid, I remember this as one of the raids when we were more apprehensive about what might have happened than actually did happen. This is one that stands out in our memory. We really thought we were on fire at low level over a heavily defended target, and therefore wouldn't stand a chance of getting out. Yet in this case it really was nothing serious at all.
It must have been one of the longest raids you did.
7 hours 40 minutes, yes, on the 17th of August, 43.
Was it explained to you beforehand the importance of this raid, why it was so important?
We were told, yes, it was I think that was on the occasion. We had Harris himself visit our station, although I'm not sure of that. He did visit once. We were told the target was so important that despite the fact that the moon was up and would be for some while, that we would go back to the target night after night until we obliterated it. But we were told that it was because they were developing a new anti-bomber device, and it was absolutely in our own interest that we should smash the place up. A sort of carrot, which, you know, I don't think it mattered very much at that particular time, but certainly it gave a reason for the importance of this particular station being bombed, so there it was.
They obviously couldn't risk giving you the real reason.
No, because the Germans apparently didn't even realise that we knew where Peenemünde was at that stage prior to the raid itself.
What kind of an impression did Harris make on you?
It was only a very brief one, but it's difficult to say. But he seemed such a nice, mild-mannered sort of individual. There was a lot of confidence, I think, we got from the few minutes he appeared. But as I say, my memory's a bit hazy at this distance now, 40-odd years ago. But I think that he was really liked by his people. He was called Butch, but that was almost Butcher. That was almost an affectionate term as far as the aircrew were concerned. I don't think there was any animosity towards him whatsoever that I ever heard of.
Now, you were going to recount the Hamburg raid as well.
Yes, Hamburg towards the end of July 1943, it was decided for the first time to use window. This was the strips that were dropped to foil both the anti-aircraft guns and also of a different wavelength, those of the devices of the night fighters. On the 27th of July, the first of 4 raids took place on Hamburg, the idea being that there would be separate areas of the target to be destroyed. Hamburg was certainly a target that was not liked either. So when you flew down, as we did, from the north across the canal there, we fully expected, despite all that we've been told, to be really battered by flak. However, it proved to be exactly as they said. As we were dropping the window, the wireless operator was dropping it through a chute, and it was spreading out below us like confetti all over the place. It really worked beautifully. We were able to go right across, bomb our target without any particular trouble whatsoever, and come back almost on an uneventful trip. Now, that was followed by, we went off on leave after that, and I believe there were another 2, but we came back in time on the 2nd of August, a few days later. We went on a day's leave, that's right. We came back, and this was to be the Harcourt area of Hamburg, the southeastern quarter. We were briefed. The weather was very, very bad, or projected weather was bad, and it was known there was a front with a terrific amount of icing in it that was going towards Germany. The weather experts were trying to guess exactly when it would get to Hamburg, and the decision was that the raid would take place. However, just as our squadrons were and the Halifax squadrons were taking off, the news came through that front was right over Hamburg, and that all Halifaxes who hadn't got the ceiling of the Lancasters were to be grounded. However, unfortunately, from 2 or 3 squadrons in Yorkshire, some of the Halifaxes had already taken off, and because of the wireless silence, weren't informed of this situation. Our crew was one of them. We flew across, and when we came to the German coast, we were absolutely staggered to find this front right the way up. Our top ceiling normally was between 18 and 20, 20 if we were lucky with a full bomb load on, and we could see this was above 20,000 in places. However, we flew on and then found ourselves for the next half an hour or so in one of the worst situations we've ever been in, we were ever in at that time, just from the weather. We were icing up terribly. Icing on the wings of a plane works in 2 ways. It can accumulate in tons over a few minutes, increasing the weight of the aircraft, but also it changes the camber on the wings. From a modern aircraft, most lift comes from the top of the aircraft, from the shape and the vortex caused by the air going over it. If the ice settles there, then it changes the shape and you lose lift as well. We found ourselves like a cork. We were going up. Every time the pilot would try to give more power, we'd go up a little, then we'd drop 1,000, 2,000 feet at a time. And we'd been going for about 10 minutes, and suddenly a brilliant light lit up the aircraft. It was what the old-time sailors called St. Elmo's fire. The gunner, first of all, reported that he'd got runaway guns. They met up a gunner because there were jets of flame, probably 15, 20 feet, going from all of his 4 guns. And he thought that somehow an electrical failure was firing them. But then we realized that the 4 air screw discs were lit up with light as well, and I was in the front, in the nose, and I was able to read my map, look at my map and make out things which, and there was no other lighting at that particular time, and it really was horrendous. So we didn't realise what all this lighting was, and we weren't sure what effect it was having on the aircraft, but the instruments seemed to react. Anyway, we decided that we'd drop our bombs on the ETA and try and turn back and come back. Well, we did. We came back. We saw nothing all this time, and we were still going up and down, and the ice was coming off the propellers and hitting the side of the cockpit as it got thrown over. It really was a tremendous time. The only thing we saw of the ground was, as we came what we judged to be over the German coast, looking back, we could see a few searchlights and some flak going up, and a few lights on the ground, which we assumed was Hamburg. Whether we bombed Hamburg, we really didn't know at all. But we managed to get back without much trouble to base. The funny thing is, in the officially commissioned history of of the RAF in World War II states that no Halifaxes or Stirlings took off that night. However, my own logbook and the logbook of a pathfinder, Mr. S. Honey, records the fact some Halifaxes did take off. An article in the Evening News of September the 28th, 1954 takes up this point and mentions that Mr. Honey was writing to the ministry to have this officially changed.
Now, the raids which you've recounted all took place with 77 Squadron on your first tour of duty, I believe.
Yes, that's true.
How long did that go on for?
We finished our last trip on the 12th of November 1943, and the first one, of course, was towards the end of April that same year. So that would be, about 6 months, something like that.
What condition would you be in after that first tour? How much did it take out of you?
I think there was definitely nervous tension towards the end, but I wasn't conscious at that time of anything particularly. We were taken off operations at the end to do special duties, and we were looking forward to special duties, which we didn't know if it would might have involved more operational flying. We weren't unduly dismayed, but as it happened, the special duties were merely going over to a Lancaster group to teach people to fly on Halifaxes, because there was a shortage of Lancasters at that time. There were rumours of strikes at some of the Lancaster factories, and so for a period in 1943-44, pilots coming off Wellingtons had to go fly Halifaxes for a while, do their conversion to four-engine flying on Halifaxes, and then only in the last day or two of their course to switch to Lancasters. This took place over about 5 or 6 months. That I was on the squadron, and for that reason I moved from 4 group, which was a Halifax only group, down to 1 group, which had been Lancaster only. We went on to the heavy conversion units within that particular area.
When did your next tour start then?
Well, we weren't officially required to go back, but we'd volunteered because my pilot, who was then Flight Sergeant Daffy, had become bored up in northern Scotland with his duties, and had asked to be returned to ops, and was told that it couldn't happen. It was too short a time. However, he deliberately put up as we called it, a black, and got himself posted back. The black consisted of, the station was rather a formal one, and the group captain kept to the rules and regulations, peacetime one. My skipper, who literally drank very, very little indeed, was one night found drunk on board a donkey going through the main doors into the officers' mess and round the lounge. As a result, he was posted immediately back to an operational squadron. He phoned us. We were dispersed at that time. We had been, of course, 7. And we were able to contact 5 of us. Rear gun had gone back to Canada. And we only had to replace the wireless operator, who himself had already gone back on early. We all gathered together, and we had to report to a place called Rougheth, just outside York, for our conversion to a new mark of Halifax, which was the Mark III.
Was it much different?
Oh, the power was terrific. It was the same standard of comfort, but it really was an excellent aircraft. The only problem we found initially was a fault in the engines, which we never fully understand, but while the engines were going at full tilt, it was possible for the centre of the engine to freeze solid, while the heat was being exuded all the way around the centre, and this caused the aircraft, the engine eventually to stop. And we had 2 or 3 examples of this on tentative flights, which we had to come back to base with. They apparently cured this, and so we had no trouble, and we certainly had no trouble on operations after that. We did 20 trips in fairly quick succession.
Which squadron was this with?
Number 10 Squadron. There was one thing that irritated us a little bit. At the time, we were doing a lot of, the RAF Bomber Commander were doing a lot of short trips to the flying bomb bases and other places in France, which meant that your time over enemy territory was something like 10, 15 or 20 minutes. Now, compared with the Ruhr or Berlin, which often meant several hours over enemy territory and exposed to fighter attacks, or Berlin probably 4 or 5 hours, this was rather small. It was felt a little unfair when we were told that as experienced crews, we would not be allowed to undertake any of these trips or count them as operations. A system had been devised about that time whereby crews doing these short trips only counted as a half towards their total, or either as a first or second tour. I believe in some cases even 1/3 later. But we were never allowed to do these at all, and we had to be content with Ruhr and other targets right the way through. As I say, it was a little irritating at times, particularly when the people were back in a very, very short time, having added yet another one to their logbook.
Are there any particular raids that stick out in your mind from this second tour?
We did one raid on Bochum, which was much the same as most other raids, flak fighters and things like this, but of no great moment until we realised that we'd been hit somewhere in the hydraulic system, and our hydraulics were US, and therefore there were no flaps or brakes for us to land, and accordingly we were diverted to Woodbridge in Suffolk, which was one of the 3 so-called lame duck drones. We landed there uneventfully and parked the aircraft on the side, slept, and when we woke up next morning, found that the tail of our own aircraft had been sliced off in the night, or one fin of it had been sliced off by another aircraft slewing as it came to a stop. I was most amused to overhear other people looking at the same aircraft and saying, "Christ, how the hell did they get that plane down?" Because the tail had gone on ours. But they were looking at our aircraft, not realising that it had happened after we'd landed. But anyway, that was amusing. During the next couple of hours, we saw a rather large, there had been a rather large raid of American bombers, daylight bombers, the Sterling Fortresses and Liberators, and we watched a lot of these which have been badly shot up coming into land, and it says a terrific amount for the skill of these pilots, the way some of these aircraft were able to land reasonably intact. But one in particular, we noticed, a Fortress, had 2 engines out on one side, and was flying on 2 engines on the same side. It was making a crabwise approach to come in, and as it came down towards the ground, one of the other 2 engines started to belch smoke. The pilot, despite this, managed to put it down and did what was virtually a complete circle, just touching and turning, but still managing to keep it right way up. And that was funny, and it would have been tragic otherwise, but suddenly every port in the aircraft opened and men appeared from everywhere, pouring out, and within seconds the whole plane was abandoned. There was almost a comic scene with the way that everything happened at once. Of course, there were 11 crew in these Fortresses, and speed was of the essence when getting out of a damaged plane.
That was on the same night?
That was the next morning, because we'd slept there overnight in the special accommodation for aircrew who'd been referred there one way or the other. Most of the other trips had their own series of little events that took place, but one that I particularly remember was we were going to Cologne on the 30th of December 1944. Because of there had been 1 or 2 unfortunate accidents where where aircraft had had one engine fail on takeoff and therefore had spun into the ground. My skipper had evolved a theory that he would hold the nose of the aircraft down right to the last minute, so that should an engine fail, at least he'd have a chance to lift the aircraft over the trees at the bottom of the end of the runway and give us a possible chance to get away with crashing with a full bomb and petrol load. So, following that technique, on this particular night, he took the aircraft right down the runway, even though it was trying to get off. He kept holding a nose down. We just got to the end of the runway when and he'd started to come off the ground. Then there was a terrific flash, and we had the experience of going up in a high-speed lift. We didn't know what was happening then. It was dusk, and we looked round and thought at first we'd hit something on the ground, then possibly an aircraft, but we couldn't, looking down, see any wreckage anywhere. But the rear gunner reported a terrific pall of smoke from behind us. Anyway, the aircraft seemed to be flying all right, so the skipper asked myself to go round and check the aircraft. I went back and checked everything that was visible, then I thought I'd have a look at the bomb ports, and I opened them up, and what should have been the inside of the bomb bays, visible to me, was instead the ground. Our main bomb that night, occupying the whole of the centre section, was a blast bomb. It had fallen off, we didn't know at the time how, and had taken the bomb doors and part of the fuselage to which it was attached as well, so we were virtually naked underneath. We discovered later that although of course it fell with all the fuses intact, it had blown up. It was a feature of these bombs that, with the light case, that the fuses themselves would be driven in to the bomb itself and blow up anyway, even with the safety pins in place. But they would usually, the explosion was roughly about 2/3 of its fullest capacity. So probably we're lucky there. It must have hit the ground and carried us up, we reckon something like 600 feet. The aircraft seemed to be flying quite well. The skipper tried it out, and then we again had our little sort of crew conference and decided that as our route this time was down to, I believe, the Isle of Wight, certainly to the Channel, then go across France, then cut up into Cologne that way. We decided we'd go down to the Channel, drop our bombs. We'd have used up quite a bit of petrol. We'd drop our bombs and come back. We got down to the Channel, and the skipper said, well, if anything, the plane's flying better than usual. So we decided that we'd carry on with the main stream. We did, and we dropped our stuff on Cologne in due course with the usual resistance and so on there. But it wasn't until we actually came back and were landing that we had any trouble at all. And then as we came down, possibly due to a build-up of air inside the aircraft, we began to skid all over the air, or it seemed to be, but we were fortunately able to touch down reasonably well and on our own wheels, and so we're perfectly okay there. There was a slight sequence to this too, which I found rather amusing, and we all found rather amusing at the time. That was that, a sequel I should say. We'd been doing some bombing practice on our bombing range, which was situated just off the end of the runway of 10 Squadron's drone, and I'd had an argument with the people on the so-called quadrants who plotted the bombs when they fell. What I hadn't realised at the time was we had quite a serious fault in our bomb sight, and the scatter of bombs they'd given me on a plot chart I disagreed with. Anyway, it was found that there was an error in the bomb sight, and when corrected it brought back to a reasonable figure. But I was certainly at loggerheads with the people. Now, when apparently the senior officer in charge of the quadrants on the range came in next morning, there was a large crater on his range, a colossal great crater for results of this bomb, and he inquired, and someone said, well, an aircraft had dropped a bomb, and he phoned up the station and said, what happened? They told him this blast bomb had dropped, and he said, who was the pilot? And they said, Treadwell. And apparently there was a silence for a moment. He said, Christ, I didn't think he'd take it that badly. Because I'd had this argument with him, but anyway, that may or may not be of any interest to you.
Did you ever raid submarine pens?
No, that was another one of these short-term ones. They could be quite hectic because you've got a hell of a lot of flak, and we had a healthy respect for flak at night. So what they must have been like in daylight, what we hated was light flak, because we'd seen aircraft shot down by light flak, and it was cruel to see an aircraft going down already in flames, absolutely being hosepiped by shells. The technique on near place on the coast was to get, if an aircraft was hit up above, the searchlights would bring it down. They would come right down with it as far as they could, and the light flak would open up. And as I say, hosepipe was the right thing, because shells would come up seemingly by the thousand to cut them to pieces before they even touched the ground.
Even though it was a stricken plane?
Oh yes, because they couldn't take a chance on, well, that was the reasoning behind this. They wouldn't take a chance on it getting away.
So flak worried you more than night fighters?
No, that's not quite true. It was more of a psychological worry than the fighters, although flak was funny. Going over a target, in the light of all the light that appeared over a target normally, you'd see what appeared to be almost like a chainmail barrier. Thousands of puffs of smoke where shells had exploded, but the mine somehow treated that as if they were still there. It was a barrier, and these little pinpoints of light that were appearing among them, of course, with the fresh shells going in there. But you certainly had the feeling that you were trying to get through an impenetrable barrier because of these bursts there. But fighters were certainly the worst things that we feared. We were very fortunate. We only had 2 attacks by fighters, and or 2 not even attacks. We only got fired at once, and that was over Yorkshire by an enemy fighter. We might have had attacks which we'd avoided because using the various devices you could turn off if you felt a fighter was coming in towards you. Forgotten the device that we used to carry in the tail at a certain stage. Again, later it was found this also gave our position away. But no, fighters were certainly the things that brought aircraft down. We were extremely lucky in that we never were exposed, as far as we know, to attack from these aircraft that they introduced in, I think it was 1944. The upward-firing cannon aircraft. The RAF were completely at sea over this. They never realised for months what was happening and how our losses were suddenly mounting. But the Germans had pinched a technique of ours, a technique which we'd used in 1940 on the Defiant, of having upward-firing guns. And in 1944, I think it was, they produced this, there was a name for it, Musica, something Musica. It was a slang name which was used. It accounted for a lot of aircraft during that period because the aircraft was able to fly undetected under the aircraft, and they could do it so well they could even determine to within feet where they were going to fire. And they used to fire under the starboard outer wing into the petrol tanks on that side, and they would wait until they got exactly to that, and then they would open fire with a cannon. A lot of aircraft went down and no one had a clue as to why they'd gone down. One or two planes did report seeing what they thought were upward-firing cannons, but this was disregarded by the Air Ministry for months, until finally it realised that they had introduced this. But anyway, this technique at that stage, late stage of the war, really was bringing aircraft down. The only time we really engaged a fighter seriously, he wasn't attacking us, he was attacking another aircraft. On one raid, unfortunately I haven't noted in my logbook, I'd just dropped the bombs over the target, but I'd been keeping an apprehensive eye on a Halifax just above us with his bomb bays open and his bombs still there. We'd been hit on 2 previous trips by other people's bombs, once seriously, and so we were very careful not to position ourselves that way, and we were watching this as I dropped the bomb, so I looked up. At that moment, a Focke-Wulf 190 cut across our nose, so close you felt you could touch it. He obviously hadn't seen us, but he dropped back under the tail of this other Halifax, which was, as I say, just above us. And for what seemed minutes, no one in the crew said anything, but apparently as I was watching, so was the pilot, so was the engineer and the mid-upper gunner, all shocked to see this thing coming quite so close. And then suddenly we all let yell at the same time. The mid-upper gunner realised he ought to be doing something, and the plane was absolutely point blank. He forgot all his drill. He'd never fired at a German aircraft before. And instead of firing in bursts, he kept his fingers on the trigger and at point blank range poured in the 4,000 rounds that were in the belts of his guns. Whether it was from the sheer weight of the bullets going in or whether he'd been hit on a vital spot immediately, we don't know. But the plane dropped like a bullet straight down to the ground. It crashed just under some light clouds. I believe this was confirmed from another source at the time, but it was still only claimed as a probable because we did not actually see it hit the ground itself, but barely under the cloud. The gunner, who partly because of his 2 tours, but principally because of this incident, was later awarded the DFC when he finished his 2nd tour with us.
And you were never actually shot down yourself?
No, we had, because of fires on board and being hit with flak, I think it was 2 or 3 times I had my parachute ready to go and the skipper was able to hold things, so we had no real trouble that way.
How did your tour with 10 Squadron end? Did it go into 1945?
Yes, it went in 1945. February was a good month in that we completed 8 trips, 7 of them at night and 1 as a daylight raid on Mainz. The last 2 occurred in March, when I was screened for the 2nd time.
When you were?
Screened. That was the technical term for coming off ops at that stage.
What did that involve, the screening?
Just that you could be allocated to other jobs. There is a small point here that probably rashly, a couple of years before, when losses were very high, someone had decided that should they ever have anybody who survived 2 tours, they would arranged that he would be able to have a say in where he was posted afterwards. Accordingly, I was sent off on indefinite leave, ready for the next posting, but I'd only been on leave for about a week or so when I got a recall telegram telling me to report to a place called Westcott in Buckinghamshire, with no explanation at all. When I arrived on Westcott Station, it was to find another 20 or 30 aircrew, some of whom just finished their first, and the odd one who'd finished his second tour. No one had any idea what we were there for. It turned out next day that we were due to take charge of the repatriation of British prisoners of war which were coming back from Germany. And it was a job which covered the next 2 months.
What did it involve?
Well, we had to act as a reception crew, we had to take names, the details of each person, and then we had a very elaborate arrangement for dividing all the prisoners up into their particular sections and sending them off to special camps. Now, we had to divide them between the services, between the countries, dominions, and we had, I think, about 30 different places they could be sent to. While they were with us, many of the people were shocked, very seriously shocked, after 4 years of captivity and suddenly being whipped back to this country. We had to handle them very carefully. We had many volunteer WAFs on the station who looked after them, gave them cups of tea, generally spoke to them, and while we were waiting to ship them off into these lorries or by train, I've forgotten to say that because I was the senior one there, I was put in charge, and I found an MT officer from London who came to act as an advisor on the transport side. The Army produced a colossal number of 6-ton trucks, which we had to use as and when, some cases sending one man possibly on a 100-mile journey on a 6-ton truck. But considering all the problems and the fact there'd never been anything like this before, it went off very smoothly. Winston Churchill had sent a special message that no expense was to be spared in getting these people back into sort of relative comfort at home. We worked all hours of the day and night. The original idea had been that I think it was 20 different aerodromes all over east and southern England were to be allocated so many planes per day. Unfortunately, the system broke down. Some of the heavy planes landing on the smaller drones broke up the surface, and we suddenly found that instead of 20 there were only about half a dozen working, and even that came to an abrupt halt. We found that there were just 3 drones able to take the aircraft. There was Wing, where I'd been in previous years, Westcott, which wasn't very far away, and my satellite at Westcott, the other drone.
And what?
A satellite drone. You know, you had a main drone and you had a satellite a runway there. These were the only 3 that were actually operating. That partly came about because of the serviceability of the drones, but also because there'd been, if you like, a breakdown in the organisation. What had happened in particular was that the Americans were flying Dakotas across with jerry cans, the petrol cans, and landing where they could, usually on the Autobahn, and dropping these petrol cans along the sides of the road to be picked up. Now, while they were doing that, a lot of our prisoners of war who'd been marching backwards and forwards, first towards the Eastern Front, then back towards the Western Front, were on the road, having been released and in a bad state. And the pilots were asking them if they'd like a lift back. And these chaps were accepting. So we suddenly found that we were getting aircraft for which there'd been no schedule whatsoever, were appearing on the circuit with these prisoners of war. We were expecting to pick up something like 100 men a day to transport through our centre. And we suddenly found situations where anything up to 20 aircraft, 20 Dakotas would appear on the circuit, each with 30 men in. So you'd have 600 men landing. Of course, we called on all the volunteers to handle them. And unfortunately, again, they didn't restrict their hours to decent times, so that at 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd suddenly find you'd just been to sleep for an hour or 2 hours, you get a call out again, another 10 aircraft on the circuit, you know, and oh God, I've never been so tired. Anyway, it worked out very well indeed. I think there were 100,000 prisoners expected through, and I think we took on our one pair of drones about 60,000 of them.
When you said they needed careful handling, do you mean to say they might fly off the handle?
No, they might collapse in tears sometimes, or actually collapse, because the sort of thing that happened was that when they went into these hangars, which we converted into places where they were sprayed with the newfangled DDT, Every man was sprayed, and this was a little bit undignified. You shot them down their trousers, up their shirts and everything else there with these flit sprays. Many of them had really been in German hands less than 24 hours before, so that they were in a state of complete confusion. They had to be led in certain directions. You saw the way where they'd gathered their kit. They'd had possibly over 4 or 5 years, or 4 years certainly, their soap, their little personal belongings, which they had to put down while they were being deloused and while they were having their cup of tea. And to begin with, their eyes would never leave these little piles on the floor. After a while, they began to relax, and of course what happened inevitably was that possibly after 2 hours of being there and then being loaded into trucks, they walked straight past these possessions which they'd sort of guarded and forgot all about them. So every night we had to clear up all sorts of things of which there was very little way of identifying. Some had numbers on, some hadn't, but it was rather pathetic to see all these things, as I say, which they'd so jealously guarded, completely forgotten. We had some come back with things we had to take away. We had one party on an aircraft come back, each man had a shotgun, beautiful German shotgun. When these prisoners of war were marching past a place that our troops had overrun in northern Germany, one of our bulldozers was going over the top of all the shotguns taken from the factory in the yard and was smashing them all up. And one of the, I gather one of the prisoners said, "Couldn't we have one?" And they said, "Help yourself." So every man came off with a shotgun, beautiful one. Unfortunately, we had to take them all away from them.
So that was the last job that you actually did in the RAF, was
it?
No.
No. What happened then was the RAF kept their promise. After about 2 months on this job, I was sent off again on leave to await a new job in which I would have some sort of choice. Now, I would register myself in Whitehall at the appropriate department, and every week I was phoned to say that there were a few jobs going. Would I care to consider them? Well, I'd been on leave for about 3 or 4 weeks because what they were offering me, frankly, was not anything I would have liked anyway. And then I was called rather excitedly by this officer concerned. "I've got a good job that might interest you." So I went down to Whitehall and was told that there was a section which I'd never heard of before called the Top Secret Dispatch Couriers. Their job was to carry all top secret dispatches round the world. For instance, when Churchill made his visits abroad, there was always one courier every day following him behind with all the top secret stuff and also bringing it back. So they went to Canada, to Yalta, North Africa. Everywhere he went, that was part of their duties to follow him. When they weren't working specifically for Churchill, they were carrying all sorts of top secret stuff for the Army, Navy or Air Force. Now at that stage, the more interesting trips, as I would have termed them, had virtually gone, but the section which consisted of 6 officers and I believe 2 corporals. One was about to retire and they needed a replacement. I went to see this place at what they called the Rotunda, the office, which was 2 floors underground just off Horse Ferry Road. Colossal great concrete bunker as it was. I wasn't able to see the CO. I met his deputy, and during a little preliminary discussion we got on to crosswords. This was supposed to be an interview for the job, I may say, and I learnt that he'd been setting the crossword for the Times, Telegraph and the Radio Times before the war, and I was interested. After about half an hour's discussion on all this, I said, "Well, shouldn't we start the interview proper?" He said, "You're in." So, and I became a courier. Now, as I say, it was late in the war, so that the interesting trips were no longer there. I think the only one that I could have attended was cancelled. That was to Iceland. But what I did get involved in was a so-called milk run to Belgium and Germany. We sent 1 or 2 couriers every week, sometimes 3 or 4, to Montgomery in Germany, also to the Naval C&C in Minden, and carrying what we called the Admiral's washing. But all the top secret stuff had to go through, in many cases, through Brussels, because we picked up and returned other stuff there as well. So that I found myself roughly twice a week staying in Brussels overnight and catching early planes out in either direction. It was a very interesting period. I liked the job. It was varied occasionally by a trip up by car to Great Malvern, to the then secret place TRE, to pick up top secret stuff, including the plates which had been used by the Enigma type equipment that we were using, to have them officially broken up in Whitehall. Occasional one to Northern Ireland, 1 or 2 up to Prestwick to pick up stuff from other couriers coming across the Atlantic. I had that job until I was actually demobbed.
When was that approximately?
April 1946.
So you were doing the dispatch work 45, 46?
Yes. We had a letter which we carried with us which authorised us to take priority in many cases, to break the rule about all official documents in an aircraft being handed to the pilot. We kept those on our own person. We were allowed to exceed the speed limit on the roads. And we had instructions to ensure that we got our documents at the highest possible speed backwards and forwards, and to that extent we were authorised to demand passengers on aircraft, even to the extent of turning people off to get on. Now, I didn't have to use that much because, fortunately, from Northolt there was a twice daily service on Ansons to the continent, the air delivery service to the ADLS, to the forces there, and in many cases I flew by Anson, so I had many Anson flights backwards and forwards during that period. Very little of event. We took over one of the best hotels in Brussels as the permanent bedroom there, and it really was, although it was at times a little hectic in making dates and driving across the autobahns at night and things like this, it really was a worthwhile job, I felt at the time. I was offered a permanent commission at the end, but was told the job itself would probably peter out and much of the activity would go back to the so-called Silver Greyhounds, the Foreign Office Special Messenger Service, and as I wasn't interested in any other part of the RAF, I decided not to accept it.
Could I ask you one or two questions in general about the bomber offensive during the war? Because many people like Bennett and so on have talked about the tremendous contribution that the bomber offensive played in the war, saying they made the point that for a bomber crew, each particular operation was like a battle for somebody in the army, and yet you had a whole tour of these. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I do. I've seen at different times in the past comparisons about the number of shells that were thrown at a comparatively small number of aircraft compared with the barrages of the 1418 war, and it was reckoned that many trips on places like the Ruhr was certainly the equivalent of going over the top in some of the worst battles of the war, of that war. The First World War was characterised by the fact that we lost a heck of a lot of subalterns, young subalterns, 50, 60, 70,000 I believe from distant memory, but we lost close on 60,000 aircrew, mostly in Bomber Command. In fact, in Bomber Command, yes, during that period of the run-up, principally 43 to 44 and 45, and as Harris himself pointed out, we actually suffered more fatal casualties in that time than the entire British forces invading Europe. So certainly the contribution, I think, was terrific. It was a pity. Up until the last stages of the war, there was no doubt about the RAF and particularly Bomber Command, was a favourite with the public. Political views suddenly changed in 45. Now, people were looking ahead, they realised the war was running downhill, and it was more politics than anything else that mattered. And the fact that you besmeared some of your opponents was quite legitimate at that stage. It became a political business. Some of the stories I've seen in print since are absolutely ridiculous. The suggestion that aircrew themselves could select a target or decide not to go or go anywhere at all was so ridiculous. You never knew what was there anyway. You were told, you were given a picture, you were given a target, you were told what was in that particular aiming point and what was round about it, but no one said to you that there's thousands of refugees here or anything like that at all. And Dresden, I've seen reports on that. The suggestion seemed to be the aircrew should have refused to go. On the other hand, they didn't know anything about this, but because I believe no aircraft was shot down in the Dresden raid, that was regarded as a demerit. If, as had been possible that night, the RAF, the Luftwaffe had been able to get off the deck correctly and attack and shoot down a lot of our aircraft, there might have been some justification. Now, we've heard stories about the fact that the Luftwaffe, in its form of night fighters, was still able to deal a crippling blow against any formation, but owing to what I heard was the CO having been killed at an early stage, no instructions were given for any fighter planes to take off. They were just sat around the whole raid. Now, to my mind, as I say, if they'd taken off and if the aircraft had been shot down, if there'd been more British blood spent at that particular time, it would have been regarded as legitimate. Who was to know these refugees were there? Certainly the aircrew didn't know. People might have known higher up the tree. But as it was, we'd heard the Russians had specifically asked us to bomb these towns, and they were our allies, even if we were rather distant allies, and this was carried out. But the vilification of the bomber command after the war was absolutely atrocious. I just didn't understand why. This sudden, abrupt change, except on political grounds.
Do Bomber Command people nowadays feel aggrieved about this type of thing?
Oh yes, very seriously, because the effect was that, as you probably know, campaign medals were issued to most people for anything that was notable, the Western Desert and things like this. But nothing was given to the RAF for Bomber Command offensive the whole time. Harris, the stories vary a bit there, but he was the only one of the commanders who wasn't made, whatever it is, a baron or any other particular title. He wasn't given, and he was ostracized. He was an individualist, he knew what he wanted. They never gave him what he wanted, but they criticized him because he didn't achieve what he said, despite the fact they hadn't given him what he'd asked for. So, no, we felt aggrieved on his score too. We really felt he'd been shabbily treated. Oh yes, there's certainly this. As you probably know, in the last year or two, there's been an attempt by the people still surviving to set their own medal up. There have been petitions for that particular thing, and an unofficial one has in fact been adopted, I believe. I wouldn't take it myself because it's not worthwhile. I think it's got to be an official one or nothing.
You've touched on criticisms of Bomber Command there. There are really two criticisms, basic criticisms which have been made. One on the grounds that you've touched on of that it's not a moral thing to bomb civilians, and the other one is that the resources could have better been used for some other purpose.
Well, take the first one. The Germans had a far better system of air raid shelters than we ever had. The vast majority of the towns we were attacking, most of the people were down in the shelters, and we knew that. The idea was to disrupt. A lot of the light industry, which, as in this country, was being used to bolster the main factories, was spread throughout the different areas. You couldn't have bombed them individually. The only way was to take a complete area out. And this is what was happening. And if you'd seen the results of some of those raids, it was frightening in that half a town would have disappeared. But most of the people that were there had already gone to shelters. Some were killed, but the losses were never in proportion to the amount of damage that was done. Hamburg was a terrific case, as you probably know. Speer, the armaments sort of director, he's on record as having said that if we could have done this on 2 or 3 more towns, it could probably have knocked their resistance right out. People attacked the RAF, but I believe the RAF sank more German capital ships than the Navy did themselves. It sank a lot of shipping, a lot of submarines. It really was a multifarious operation, the way the things were being done. We were bombing things in Friedrichshafen, right the way up to Norway, attacking U-boats up there, attacking the battleships, bombing the sites down over the channel. Now, this is something that Harris reckoned in his term was a waste of time, because these were precision targets that should have had precision attacks rather than the type of aerial bombing which we had to adopt. The Americans, certainly during many of their earlier daylight raids, were no better. In fact, they were very much worse in many of their attacks, the scattering and places like that. I did hear in Germany there was the feeling that the Americans did more damage to the civilians than the RAF did, which was totally different from the view that was held after war over here. But they did a fantastic job. We did a very good job indeed. So I feel these recriminations are out of balance. They haven't looked at the whole picture. The fact that all these factories were knocked out. When the invasion was taking place, the guns that were attacked, before the invasion took place, all the marshalling yards across France and Belgium were attacked, and many of these raids were actually pinpoint accurate on marshalling yards. They would take a complete marshalling yard out with all its warloads and leave the houses intact either side. Many of the photographs I saw confirmed that. We were using newer techniques at that time, and it really was turning into a pinpoint bombing type attack. We caught a cold on 1 or 2 of those trips because the Germans somehow seemed to anticipate we were going. A friend of mine in the RAF was killed at Mailly-le-Camp, which is one of those where I think something like 42 planes went down in about 15 minutes because the German flak gunners were waiting for them. But there was a lot of this build-up, but somehow it's all lost in a wash. Dresden seems to be the thing that has reversed everything that happened throughout the war. One thing I'd like to add is about the accuracy of bombing in the later stage of the war due to the terrific improvement in bomb sights. The original Mark 9 bomb sight was, frankly, a very sort of simple affair which gave little accuracy and took no account of all the different variabilities that they met in bombing. The Mark 14 was a jump into a completely new age. Here, instead of looking at a sort of back sight and front sight, as with a rifle, we suddenly for the first time had a device which enabled us to look both at the bomb sight in effect and the ground at the same time. One of the problems with the old bomb sight was that if you were looking at the bomb sight itself, then you had to adjust when you wanted to look at the ground, which was 20,000 feet away. With the new type of bomb sight, this was completely overcome. You actually looked into a solid block of glass, and by means of a light source from over the top of your head, you saw reflected there what appeared to be a sword of red light. Now, the idea was to guide the aircraft onto the target and get the target to slide down, in effect, the shaft of the sword until it met the cross-section. And at the cross-section you pressed the bomb release, and of course away it went. When running up to a target, particularly against flak, you couldn't fly straight and level for any length of time, otherwise you'd have been caught. So the pilot had to dodge backwards and forwards. Now, with the gyros which supported this glass plate, that was overcome because you kept in the same position relative to the ground, despite the fact that the pilot might be banking a complete aircraft to port or starboard. So you could get a continuous straight line, as I say, with your eyes fully accommodated, and it's the type of thing that anyone with very little practice could have used. It was supported by a computer, a mechanical computer, which I believe eventually drove its designer, this is the popular fallacy perhaps, drove him mad in designing a single plate. It was a highly successful operational bomb sight, so much so that the Americans, when they came over here with their Schneider and another type of bomb sight, which they reputedly could use to drop bombs in apple barrels, they found that their own bomb sights under operational conditions just didn't work. So they went for the Mark 14. As is inevitable during war, the production here wasn't sufficient, so it was transferred to the States, where it appeared, literally months later in large numbers, but renumbered the P1. I had the modification some time after we'd been using it to be on an American aerodrome, and as a courtesy showing one or two of the aircrew round our plane in return for seeing theirs. And I heard this man look at our bomb having looked at our bomb sight, say, "I guess we've given you one of our bomb sights there, haven't we? That's our P1. I soon disillusioned him about where the bomb sight had come from. But it really was, as far as I know, the best bomb sight of the war. I don't know how long it went on after the war, but I know it was in existence even then.
Were the bomb sights easy for you to use as a bomb aimer?
Yes, the only problem was you had to, of course, when running up on the target, because we only had a limited amount of blower, I think was the term, you either operated the automatic pilot, George, through this mechanism, or the bomb sight. So 20 minutes before the target, if the pilot hadn't already taken George out, you had to remember to switch on, otherwise the gyros would not be working sufficiently hard to pick the bomb sight up, because the glass plate would fall to one side when not in use.